The night had fallen heavy over the valley, a blanket of deep blue stitched with stars. Yet it offered little warmth to those who had no hearth to sit beside. Clara sat on the worn step of her crooked wooden cabin, hugging her knees close to her chest. The cabin was no more than a gift of pity, left behind by a kind farmer who had died long ago, and it creaked and groaned with every breath of wind. For Clara, only 12 years old and already orphaned, it was both a prison and a sanctuary. It sheltered her from the rains, from the prowling wolves, from the cruel stares of people in town who muttered under their breath about the ragged girl with no family. But inside its walls, silence pressed down like a weight, and silence could feel colder than any winter wind. Her stomach growled softly, a reminder that she had not eaten since a stale piece of bread the morning before. Clara pressed her palm against her belly as if she could quiet it. But the ache lingered. She tried to distract herself by staring at the stars, wondering if her parents could see them too, wherever they were. Sometimes she imagined her mother's gentle voice telling her stories of brave heroes, of people who chose kindness even when fear told them to look away. Sometimes she thought of her father's strong hands, how they had once lifted her high into the air as if she could touch the sky itself. But now they were gone, taken by fever one after the other, leaving Clara in a world that seemed too large, too wild, and too indifferent to care for one small girl. She pulled her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. It was threadbare, filled with holes, but it was the last piece of her mother's belongings she still had. She could not bear to part with it, though it did little to keep out the chill. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing across the dark hills. Clara shivered, but she wasn't ready to retreat inside. Something about the river's whisper drew her that night. She rose slowly, rubbing her arms, and walked toward the sound of rushing water. The river was not far, a wide, restless vein that cut through the valley floor. Clara had always loved it. Its ceaseless motion, the way it carried secrets from places she could only dream of, places she might never see. But the river was also dangerous, swollen with autumn rains, its current sharp and unforgiving. People in town warned children never to get too close, never to cross when the waters ran high. Clara had listened, but curiosity always led her back to its edge. She crouched by the bank, her reflection rippling in the dark water. For a moment she thought she saw herself differently, not as a poor lonely girl, but as someone braver, someone with a story worth telling. Then a sound shattered the stillness, a faint splash followed by a stifled cry. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. She straightened quickly, eyes scanning the opposite bank. At first she saw nothing but the twisting shadows of trees. Then movement caught her eye, a figure struggling at the water's edge. It was a girl, older than Clara by a few years, though not yet grown. Her hair was long and dark, clinging wet to her face. She leaned heavily on one leg, while the other seemed to falter beneath her weight. Clara realized with a jolt that the girl was limping, her steps clumsy and desperate. She was trying to cross the river alone. Clara's breath quickened. She had heard whispers in town about native people living deeper in the woods, about warriors and families who hunted the land long before settlers built their cabins and fences. Some spoke of them with fear, others with disdain, but Clara had never seen one up close. And now, here was a girl, alone, injured, her dark eyes wide with both determination and pain. The girl stepped into the river, wincing as the current seized her legs. She staggered, catching herself on a rock, but Clara could see it was hopeless. The water would knock her down within moments, and then Clara swallowed hard. She didn't want to think of what the river could do. For a moment, fear rooted her to the spot. She thought of what people might say if they saw her helping. They might call her a traitor, whisper even harsher things. And what if the girl wasn't alone? What if warriors were watching from the trees, ready to strike if she made the wrong move? But then Clara remembered her mother's stories. Heroes didn't wait for someone else to step forward. Heroes acted even when no one was watching. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stepped into the shallows, the icy bite of the water stealing her breath. "Wait," she called, her voice trembling. The limping girl looked up, startled. For a moment their eyes locked. Clara's wide and uncertain, the other girl's filled with a mix of fear and stubborn pride. She shook her head slightly as if to say she didn't need help. But her body told another story, swaying unsteadily against the current. Clara pressed forward. Each step was a battle as the river shoved against her legs, threatening to topple her small frame. Stones shifted beneath her bare feet, sharp edges cutting at her skin. She bit back a cry and forced herself onward. The water rose to her knees, then her thighs. The cold was a fire searing her nerves until she thought she might collapse. Finally, she reached the girl. Up close, Clara could see how pale she was beneath the moonlight, how her lips trembled from both cold and pain. Clara extended her hand. "Take it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The girl hesitated, pride flickering in her eyes. But the river surged harder and her injured leg buckled. She had no choice. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she placed her hand in Clara's. Clara tightened her grip, surprised at the strength in the girl's fingers despite her weakness. Together they moved step by step, Clara leaning her small weight against the current, guiding the girl toward the opposite bank. Every step felt endless, the roar of the river filling Clara's ears, her body trembling with the effort. Her shawl, soaked and heavy, dragged at her shoulders, but she refused to let go. At one point the girl stumbled, her foot slipping on a slick stone. The river lunged to swallow her, but Clara yanked her upward with every ounce of strength she had. Her heart hammered wildly. She was certain they would both fall, but somehow they steadied again, clinging to each other like lifelines. When at last they reached the far side, Clara's knees nearly gave out. She collapsed onto the damp earth, gasping, her chest burning. The girl sank beside her, clutching her injured leg, her breathing ragged. For a long moment they simply sat there, the river's roar behind them, the forest silent around them. Clara glanced sideways at the girl, uncertain of what to say. The girl met her gaze. There was no smile, no words of thanks, but something in her eyes had softened, a glimmer of respect, maybe even gratitude. She nodded once sharply, as if acknowledging a debt too deep for words. Before Clara could speak, the girl struggled to her feet, leaning on a carved wooden staff she had carried. She gave Clara one last searching look, then limped into the trees, vanishing into the shadows as if the forest had swallowed her whole. Clara sat there, shivering, her body aching from cold and fear and effort. She could still feel the warmth of the girl's hand in hers, lingering like a secret she wasn't meant to tell. She had no idea who the girl was or what her story might be. But Clara knew one thing. Something had shifted in the world tonight. Something unseen had taken notice of her choice, and it would not be forgotten. The stars above seemed brighter now, as if they too had witnessed what had passed. And though Clara was still alone, still hungry, still small against the vastness of the night, her heart beat with a strange new strength. For the first time in a long while, she felt less like an orphan, and more like the kind of hero her mother used to speak of. Clara's shawl was still damp when she stumbled back into the crooked little cabin, her body trembling from the icy grip of the river. The moment the door closed behind her, the silence returned, thick and heavy. She leaned against the rough wood, heart pounding as if she had run a great distance. Her hands were raw, scraped from the stones of the river, and her feet ached from cuts she hadn't noticed in the darkness. Yet none of it mattered. What consumed her now was the memory of those eyes, the limping girl's eyes. They had been sharp and dark, filled with something she could not name. Not just pain, not just fear, something more. Something that lingered even now, echoing in Clara's mind long after the girl had vanished into the trees. Clara had met people before, farmers, merchants, women who clutched their children's hands tighter when she passed by. But no gaze had ever struck her like that one. Silent yet speaking volumes, carrying weight beyond words. Clara pressed her shawl to her face, trying to breathe warmth back into her chilled skin. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke from the small fire she had managed earlier, though it had burned down to embers now. She crouched near it, coaxing a small flame from the coals with bits of bark and twigs she had gathered. Her fingers shook too much, and several times the spark nearly died. At last a thin flame caught, flickering stubbornly in the gloom. She huddled close, holding her hands out as the firelight painted trembling shadows along the walls. Her mind refused to settle. Questions crowded her thoughts. Who was that girl? Why had she been alone, trying to cross the river at night? Where was her family, her people? Clara thought of the whispers she'd overheard in town, the way settlers spoke of native warriors with hushed voices, as if afraid the mere mention of them would summon danger. Keep away from their land, the men would warn. They watch from the trees. They strike without warning. Women repeated stories of raids, of arrows flying through the dark, but Clara had never believed everything they said. Now she wondered how much of it was truth, and how much was just fear twisting itself into tales. She remembered the limp, The way the girl's leg buckled beneath her, and the stubborn set of her jaw as she pressed on through the current. Clara knew what it meant to be stubborn. Hunger had made her stubborn. Loneliness had made her stubborn. Life itself demanded stubbornness, or it swallowed you whole. That girl had carried the same fire in her, though hidden beneath exhaustion and pain. But why had she not spoken? Not a single word had passed between them. Not even a whisper of thanks. Only that nod, quick and firm like the closing of a door. Clara rubbed her arms, unsettled. She wanted to believe she had done something good, something her mother would have been proud of. Yet a small voice whispered doubt in her mind. What if the girl had not wanted her help? What if she had broken some rule she did not understand, crossed into a story that was not hers to enter? Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, carrying with it sounds that made Clara's skin prickle. A branch creaked like a step. The river murmured louder, as though gossiping to the night. She pulled her shawl tighter around herself and crawled onto the small pile of blankets she called a bed. Her limbs were heavy with fatigue, but sleep would not come easily. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the girl again. Her face pale in the moonlight, her figure swallowed by the dark forest. Clara turned onto her side, pressing her cheek against the worn blanket. She told herself stories, the way her mother once had, hoping they might lull her into rest. Stories of kindness being rewarded, of lost wanderers who turned out to be queens or heroes in disguise. She imagined the girl returning one day, healed and smiling, thanking her properly. But no matter how she tried to shape the tale, unease threaded through it. What if others had seen her by the river? What if the girl told her people about the small orphan who had interfered? Would they see it as kindness or insult? Her chest tightened at the thought. She had no one to protect her. No family to stand between her and danger. If those whispers about warriors watching from the shadows were true, what chance did a little girl have? The fire crackled low, the flame dwindling again, and shadows crept longer across the cabin walls. Clara shut her eyes tight, clutching her shawl as if it could shield her from the world. She must have drifted, though uneasily, for the next thing she knew, she was in a dream. In it, the forest stretched endlessly around her, the trees towering higher than mountains. A drumbeat pulsed in the distance, low and steady, like a second heartbeat beneath her own. She followed it, feet bare on the soft earth, until she came to a clearing lit by firelight. Figures moved around the flames, their faces hidden, their voices chanting in a tongue she could not understand. At the center stood the limping girl, no longer weak but tall and radiant, her staff raised high as though commanding the fire itself. Clara tried to call out, but her voice vanished in the smoke. The girl turned toward her, eyes piercing as before. She lifted her hand, pointing directly at Clara, and the chant rose louder, thunderous until the ground shook beneath her. Clara stumbled back, heart hammering, and then she woke with a start, breath ragged, the dream dissolving into the dim cabin. Her skin was clammy with sweat despite the cold. Outside, the silence was strange. Too still. No owls, no night birds, not even the rustle of small creatures. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Clara sat up, straining to listen, her heart thudding in her ears. Had she truly dreamed the drumbeat, or had it been real, faint and far away, seeping into her sleep? She couldn't be sure. Fear gnawed at her, but so did curiosity. She wanted to look outside, to see if the trees concealed watchers, but her body remained frozen on the blanket. Every story she had ever heard pressed down on her. Stories of warriors appearing out of nowhere, of children disappearing into the woods, of vengeance carried in silence. She hugged her knees again, rocking slightly, trying to calm herself. "It's just a dream," she whispered into the darkness, though her voice trembled. Just a dream, but deep down she knew it was more than that. The night carried weight, a heaviness that pressed on her chest and made the air taste different. Something had changed since she had entered the river. She felt it in her bones, in the way her pulse refused to slow. The world beyond her small cabin had noticed her, and it was not done with her yet. The hours crawled by. Shadows shifted. The fire died to ash. Clara sat awake long after she should have slept, her thoughts circling like restless birds. At last, when exhaustion could not be fought any longer, her eyelids drooped, heavy as stone. The forest remained eerily silent as she slipped into a fragile, uneasy sleep. And just before the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, Clara stirred again. Something, she could not say what, pulled her from slumber. A prickle ran down her spine, a sense that eyes were upon her. She sat up slowly, every muscle tense, listening to the stillness. Then, heart pounding, she crept toward the door. Her hand hovered over the latch. She hesitated, breath shallow, afraid of what she might see. But curiosity, stubborn, unstoppable, drove her onward. She pushed the door open a crack. Cold air swept in, carrying with it a silence that felt heavier than sound. She stepped outside barefoot, the frost biting her toes, and lifted her eyes toward the horizon where the sky was just beginning to pale. And then she saw them, dozens of figures standing utterly still, their shapes sharp against the weak dawn light. Warriors. 30 of them at least. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and the world seemed to fall away. The door swung wider as Clara stepped into the morning chill. Her breath misted in the air, vanishing almost instantly, yet the knot in her chest only grew heavier. The ground was frosted white, crunching beneath her bare feet as if the earth itself wanted to betray her. Presence. She wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the cold was the least of her concerns now. They were there. Her eyes, still fogged with sleep, had not deceived her. A line of figures stood before her cabin, spread across the edge of the clearing like the silent guardians of some ancient temple. The rising light of dawn caught on the gleam of polished wood, metal, and paint. 30 warriors at least, their bodies straight and still, their faces set in a solemn stillness that was more frightening than anger. Clara froze in the doorway, heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Every story she had ever overheard in town came rushing back. Men around tavern tables whispering of raids, of arrows cutting through the dark, of families who vanished into the trees never to return. She could almost hear the hiss of their voices now. Don't look them in the eye, girl. Don't step into their path, but she had already stepped out. And they were already looking at her. The air was so quiet it seemed unnatural. No birds called, no wind stirred the pines. Even the river, though it rushed behind her cabin, sounded hushed as if holding its breath. The silence pressed against her ears until they rang. She wanted to run back inside, slam the door, hide beneath her blankets and pretend none of this was real. But her legs wouldn't move. They held her there, trembling, exposed under the weight of 30 unblinking gazes. Clara swallowed, the sound loud in her throat. Her lips felt too dry to form words, and even if she could speak, what would she say? She was one small girl with nothing but a ragged shawl and an empty belly. She had no weapon, no protection, no family to defend her. If they meant her harm, nothing could save her. The warriors did not move. Their eyes followed her, dark and piercing, unreadable. Some carried spears, their shafts carved with intricate markings. Others bore bows, arrows resting against the wood as if ready but not yet drawn. Feathers adorned their hair, paint streaked their cheeks, and each stood with the kind of stillness Clara had never seen in people before. Like trees rooted to the ground. Like shadows made flesh, time stretched unbearably. Clara felt her knees weaken, the frost burning her skin, her breath quickening in shallow bursts. And then from the center of the line, a figure stepped forward. She recognized her immediately. The limping girl. Even now, Clara's chest tightened at the memory of their struggle through the river, the icy current, the fierce grip of her hand, the way she had disappeared into the trees without a word. Now here she was, not vanishing but emerging, her presence commanding all attention. She leaned on a carved staff, its surface etched with patterns that caught the faint light of dawn. Her face was calmer than Clara remembered, but the limp remained, each step deliberate, measured. Clara's breath caught. She wanted to speak, to ask why she had come back, why she had brought so many with her. But her tongue clung to the roof of her mouth. The girl halted only a few feet away. She studied Clara in silence, her eyes as sharp as they had been by the river, though softer now as if weighing something unseen. Behind her, the warriors did not stir. The world itself seemed to bend around that gaze, forcing Clara to hold it, though every instinct screamed at her to look away. Clara's thoughts raced wildly. Were they here to punish her? To claim her cabin? To carry her away into the forest, never to return? She felt small, fragile, like a mouse cornered by wolves. Yet at the same time, something in the girl's presence stirred a strange defiance in her. Clara had faced the river's fury and not let go. She had chosen kindness when fear told her to turn away. Perhaps that counted for something now. The girl's lips parted. She spoke, her voice low and steady, words flowing in a language Clara did not know. The syllables rose and fell like music, filled with a rhythm that made Clara's heart beat faster, though she could not understand them. When the girl finished, another warrior stepped forward, older, his face lined with age, his stance dignified. "You helped her," he said in halting English, his voice deep and resonant. "Last night." You gave your hand when she was weak. Clara's mouth opened, then closed. Her voice trembled when she finally found it. I couldn't just let her drown. The old warrior's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. He turned back toward the others, speaking briefly in their tongue. The group murmured, a sound like the wind moving through branches, though no leaf stirred. Clara's stomach clenched. The limping girl stepped forward again, closer now, her staff pressing into the frost. She raised her hand slightly, and to Clara's surprise, there was no hostility in the gesture. It was almost as if she were reaching, not for her cabin, but for something deeper. Clara swallowed hard, uncertain. The silence stretched once more, heavy and waiting. Clara realized then that this moment mattered, that her next breath, her next word might shape everything that followed. She remembered the stories her mother had told, the lessons hidden in them, that courage was not the absence of fear, but choosing to act despite it. Her voice came small, but steady. She needed help. So I helped. The words hung in the air like fragile glass. The warriors exchanged glances, their faces unreadable, but none raised their weapons. The old man translated again, his tone softer this time, and Clara saw the faintest nods ripple through the line of warriors. Her heart pounded as the limping girl fixed her with that unshakable gaze. And for the first time, Clara thought she saw not just pride, not just pain, but something like understanding. The girl spoke once more. A brief string of words, and the old man's voice followed, carrying them in English. You showed her kindness when no one else would. That is remembered. The frost on Clara's toes no longer stung. The ache in her belly no longer gnawed. For a moment she felt weightless, as if she were standing not in front of 30 warriors, but in the center of a story larger than herself, one she had stepped into without knowing. Her eyes stung with sudden tears, though she blinked them back quickly. She wanted to ask what would happen now, what they wanted from her, but something told her to remain silent. The warriors seemed to understand silence better than words. The girl lowered her hand, her face unreadable once more. She turned back toward her people, speaking briefly, and the line shifted slightly, not in threat but in acknowledgement. Clara stood trembling, her shawl slipping from one shoulder, the dawn light spilling brighter across the clearing. She did not know if she had been spared, honored, or tested. All she knew was that the world would never be the same after this morning. And as the first rays of sun cut across the frost, glinting off spear tips and painted faces, Clara realized that her small act of kindness by the river had rippled outward, carrying her into the path of destiny itself.